Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very welcome to this week's edition of Farm Business Options. My name is Barry Caslin, Teagasc Energy and Rural Development Specialist, and today we're discussing the whole area of horticulture and commercial horticultural opportunities for landowners in Ireland. I'm joined here today by Dermot Callaghan. Dermot is the head of horticulture with Teagasc based at Ashtown. Good morning, Dermot. How are you?
Good morning, Barry. How are you doing?
Great to have you here today. It's a sole guest today. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 guests on the programme, but today it's just yourself, and I know you have lots to say about the area of horticulture. You've spoken at many of our events in the past. This time we're doing it online, obviously, so it's a new way of transferring the information. But I suppose, Dermot, we're really going to go through the horticulture industry after a while, and it's not an easy area. It's I believe it's worth something like €477 million in farm gate value, and it does encompass a lot of areas like vegetables, fruits, ornamentals, flower bulbs, trees, mushrooms, protected crops. This is a very large area. So there's no ways we're going to get through all of this within 1 hour. But I suppose if anybody has any particular questions that you want to ask in these different areas, you can put a question through the chat function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll put them to Dermot after a while. So Dermot, I know you have a presentation that you want to share with us. If you want to start sharing that with us, that'll be a 20-minute presentation thereabouts. I know you'll find it difficult to keep to that, but at the end of your presentation, Dermot, we'll go into the questions and answers that we have from our viewers here today.
Okay, Barry, I'm sharing now. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see that there now. Yeah, that's perfect, Dermot. So I'm going to turn off my camera and let you give your presentation, and I'll be back to you in about 20 minutes. Thanks, Dermot.
Okay, Barry, thanks a million, and I appreciate the opportunity to get involved in the option series of seminars. I'm Dermot Callaghan, as Barry said. I'm head of the Horticultural Development Department in Teagasc, and today I just wanted to try and take you through what is a very diverse sector and try and kind of characterize the sector for people and maybe highlight some potential market opportunities in the sector. My screen is not working.
Maybe you want to stop sharing, Dermot, and maybe share again.
It worked fine in
our practice session.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to characterize the horticultural sector and the scope of the subsectors in horticulture, and I want to put some emphasis on the potential options for diversification, large and small. And as Barry said, there's a Q&A to follow. The economic value of the sector: horticulture has an output value ranked 4th behind dairy, beef and pig meat, and is ahead of sheep and cereal sectors. So it's valued at 477 million farm gate in 2019. That includes potatoes. Now, in terms of Teagasc, we tend not to, in my department, I don't have a remit for potatoes. That's in the crops department. But for the purpose of data collection and data sets in terms of sector value, I will be mentioning it because it's part of the set of Department of Ag and Board BA data. So you'll see me mentioning it here. If you look at the horticultural sector 29, as I said, the breakdown is as follows: 477 million of farm gate value. Mushrooms, potatoes, field vegetables, they're ranked there in order of importance in terms of value. We'll see that even within those subsectors of horticulture, the next slide, I've just decided to try and break it down again. So if you look at protected crops, you'll see how many subdivisions there are within the protected crops. So protected crops are crops produced, both food and ornamental crops produced under protection, whether it be glasshouse crops or polythene tunnels. So that gives you a flavour of the type of complexity or diversity within each sector. So for argument's sake, we have strawberries, blackberries, raspberries, along with bedding plants and so on, each of them requiring a production protocol and very detailed knowledge about how to produce them in a volume basis. So employment in the sector, horticultural employment is estimated at over 7,000 full-time primary production, with a further 11,000 downstream. And total employment value of horticulture delivered to the Irish economy in 2016 was 479 million. So it provides about 7 or 8% of total agri-food employment. So it's an important employer. Here's a further breakdown. You can see again, it's more or less dependent on sector size. So the biggest numbers are involved in the mushroom sector, potatoes 1,344, right down to soft fruit at 967. So it's an important sector from an employment perspective directly. The area devoted to horticulture, again, you'll often see a figure. So if you look at the agricultural area in Ireland, in other words, land that's available for agriculture outside of forestry, 80% of that land is devoted to hay, grass, silage, 12% to rough grazing, 7.5% to cereals, and less than 1% for horticultural production. So it's the fourth most important sector in terms of farm gate value, but it has a footprint of less than 1% of a land requirement. So it's obviously very intensive production, high value production. The main drivers, positive and negative, in the horticultural sector at the moment, I suppose, and it's important to try and get these points across. We see a kind of a dominance of supermarket multiples who retail 92% of fresh produce in the internet, and they have international volume purchasing arrangements. So they are the main supplier of fruit and veg to the end customer. We have some below cost selling, or as others like to call it, unsustainable discounting, driving out some producers over the last decades and so on. And that has been a significant force. There has been consolidation of grower numbers in certain sectors of horticulture, moving more towards scaled production. Consumer demands for safe food and sustainability in the food chain. There's a move towards plant-based nutrition, and obviously that's a positive. Consumers are interested in health attributes of food and functional foods. So that's very positive as well. It's an important driver. DAFM Commercial Hort Grant Scheme. So the Department of Agriculture have a horticultural grant scheme every year since the early 2000s for the sector, which supports the sector. Recently, the scheme value was increased to 9 million. So it's a very important scheme where it offers the opportunity to access grant assistance for a specific equipment and machinery and infrastructure required to develop your horticultural business. So it's a very effective scheme, and it's directly for horticulture specific equipment. So really useful. It can be granted up to 40% of capital investments. And an increasing reliance on imports, potentially increasing more due to plant-based ingredient requirements for food formulation. So again, it'll come up later, but we see that food formulation in general has pivoted towards plant-based ingredients. And I suppose it is a negative if we can't produce more of those ingredients in Ireland. They will have to be sourced externally, and or imported, and that's not necessarily positive. If we look at the fresh produce market, the domestic market is the most important. As I said, 92% of fresh produce retailed through the multiples. And the fresh produce retail market. So before we talked about farm gate value of 477 million. Now, if we look at the retail market value of each of the sectors, we see that the key market for Irish produce, fresh produce retail market is valued at 1.7 billion in 2020, with fruit accounting for 841 million, vegetables 610 million, and potatoes 242 million. And then you have the food service market, which took a hit due to COVID in 2020, but in general, it's worth 400 million annually. That's the market that supplies restaurants and catering and so on. And then we have export markets for mushrooms. So the mushroom industry is one of the key sectors of horticulture which exports. So 80% of Irish production is exported to the UK. And we have in the region of 50% market share of the UK mushroom market. So that's a success story in export terms. Then we have the amenity horticulture market. Again, we have a big value retail market here in terms of the 2020 gardening market at consumer level was valued at 1.2 billion. So, that increased from somewhere in the region of 800 million in 2019 to 1.2 billion in 2020. And that was with a lockdown of 3 or 4 months at the start of the year. So you can see there was a pretty significant shift in terms of the size of that gardening market. Of this, total plants and flower category was valued at 385 million. And the total value of exports was estimated at 17 million in 2020, which included bulbs and flowers, foliage at 4.8, Christmas trees 3.4, nursery stock and at 7.3 million. So you kind of ask yourself then, one of the questions I've asked myself recently has been, are there high value opportunities, or where are the opportunities in terms of looking at imports, or where's the headroom in the sector. And I did a little exercise where I looked at the volume of imports under different categories from the Central Statistics Office data for 2019. And here I have some figures in terms of volume in tonnage of imports. And I've represented that in a percentage term. So I've looked at the import volume as a percent of the total volume based on the DAFM 29 horticultural estimates of Irish production. So we can see there quite easily that, say, for example, with the apple sector, we import 62,000 tonnes of apples, and we have, that's 95% of our dessert apple requirement. So we're heavily reliant on imports there, and you can see across the way, even if you look at soft fruit, we have 7,000 tonnes of imports. If you break that down a little bit, okay, it's 53% of reliance in terms of imports, but there's quite a skewing in terms of blueberry, where I would say 98-99% of blueberry is imported, and I think that has a retail value of about 65 million euros at this point. So very significant headroom in sectors like that. But even across all sectors, you could argue that there's some inroads to be made in terms of import substitution. Even if you look at the apple sector, nobody suggests for a moment that you could replace the 95%, but definitely inroads could be made in terms of moving towards a 20% or 30% market share of Irish produce in those areas. Okay, so why is that the case? I suppose at the end of the day, it switches back to the idea that supermarkets and multiples have international arrangements for sourcing fruit and veg. So 5 or 6 key multiples would be importing quite a lot of product from other countries. Okay. The other thing about the sector is that production is characterized by capital-intensive developments. So in order to supply these volume arrangements, as even an Irish producer, you need to have scale and you need to be efficient and so on. And so there has been a drive over the years to become more efficient and you know, in terms of labor use efficiency, but also in terms of input cost and output recovery as well. So there's a kind of a general narrowing of the margin over time, and we have a lot of technology adoption, and typical examples, you'll see some coming up shortly, but you know, this concept of smart horticulture and autonomous greenhouse production, you know, if you look to controlled environment agriculture, which is the term used, you know, that's undergoing a renaissance at the moment in terms of internationally. So there's a lot of attention being focused on glasshouse production, whether it be for its sustainability credentials or its capacity to produce food near to market in terms of making the production location independent. It also allows for new technologies in terms of labour reduction. So if you're producing under glass or polythene, under an infrastructure, or even in a mushroom production scenario, the idea that you can deploy or use automation and robotics in terms of reducing labour is much more possible. So look, this is a slide, I don't want to spend too long on it all. This is something I just wanted to put in there so that you could spend your own time looking through it. But as I said, glasshouse horticulture is a very positive development in terms of output recovery and input reduction and system efficiency, the potential to close the loop, so to speak, and reduce pesticide inputs and increase biological control and minimize nutrient loss practically to zero by closing the cycle and recycling nutrients and so on. Using CO2 that's generated from heat systems and pumping it into the glass houses also increases yield. And then there's the opportunity, of course, to use renewable sources of heat in the glasshouse sector. So you could, like the Dutch industry is moving towards geothermal or renewable sources of heat, and the opportunity even to combine or co-locate with waste heat scenarios, whether it be data centers or large buildings or whatever, where you can collect heat and recover heat and use it in these scenarios. So there's a lot of potential for this particular technology. If you look at the mushroom industry, again, it's highly technologically advanced. I suppose it's going through a reinvention in a sense in terms of, or has gone through a version 2.0. You could argue that we're looking at version 3.0 of the mushroom industry in the next 3 to 4 years, as robotics and you know, efficiencies around labour use efficiency and so on are being deployed. It's difficult to see an opportunity for new entrants here, but there are opportunities, I suppose, for the business and the industry itself. to develop, which is always positive in economic terms. So if you see a business, it's not all about providing opportunities for owner managers to develop new businesses. I suppose it's about developing the economy and developing a sector which will provide jobs in rural areas as well. So it's an important sector. Specialty mushroom production, I've just popped this in because it's a question I tend to get a lot of. This is an area that's, again, open to the vagaries of import price pressure. It's one that you would need to discuss in great detail. So I would suggest maybe making contact directly to discuss the ins and outs of this particular, possibility. Substrate production as well. You have to import the substrate at the moment. You can't source it in Ireland. So it's an issue. So food formulation and plant-based, again, it's a big area. Demand for horticultural fresh produce is growing in line with changing diet trends and demands for more plant-based nutrition, and has completely pivoted, as I said, towards plant-based ingredients. Food formulation has, so we need horticultural food as primary sources of plant-based ingredients, and it has potential. So you'll see some of the companies like Monaghan Bio, MBio, which is Monaghan Mushrooms company. They've developed powders, mushroom powders, as food ingredients, whether it be vitamin B12 powder, vitamin D powder, or mushroom powder. So, as I said, they're innovating in terms of creating new revenue streams and responding to demand for plant-based ingredients. Again, companies like Botanics in Kilkenny, they're involved in the same area in terms of food ingredients, and they're doing a lot of positive work in terms of developing plant-based nutrition alternatives, sugar alternatives, and natural colors, and so on. And then we have the whole technology on the lettuce salad side, where they've actually got to the point now where they've eliminated, through capital investment, they've eliminated the labour requirement to a large degree by automated harvesting, production and harvesting, I would say. So there are systems now, greenhouse systems of production, which allow for mechanical harvesting and automation, which has a significant upside in terms of trying to develop that in a high-cost economy like Ireland. So the market opportunities, just conscious that there's kind of a wide audience maybe watching, it's very difficult to try and pitch where the opportunities are, but I just want to highlight a few areas. I mentioned the apple sector, 135 million, Irish production is 7 million, so we can do the math. There's a lot of headroom in that sector, but there are headwinds as well in terms of how do you get market access, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to talk, maybe just make a mention of field vegetables, organic or pesticide-free production. It's in high demand. It's a growing market sector. It is an opportunity in a market context, so we have to figure out how we produce more organic production. And soft fruit, if you look, I mentioned blueberry already. Again, that's something that needs to be looked at in great detail. It is definitely an opportunity, or a potential opportunity. Salad crops, as I mentioned, lettuce, leafy greens, glasshouse production. I'll mention cut flower and foliage production, and if I have time, I'll move to nursery stock production. So, as I said, you have to understand if there's a market opportunity. Fruit, vegetable market, how do you do your market research and you try and figure out how you're going to get access to a market. So you need a network, or you need a contact, or you need to have skills in terms of accessing a market, whether it be marketing skills for local markets, like fruit and veg production for local markets it's a big ask, because you have to have knowledge around the agronomy and the KT, and you also have to be able to interface with the customer, big and small, and try and have the capacity to deliver a program or a service level that's required by that particular market. Okay, so again, just to summarize the issue around fresh market, so we have a grower plus capital, and then we have the knowledge that's required, and then you have production at farm gate. Then the other piece, which is not necessarily the case in terms of general agriculture, you need to be able to market direct or have a relationship with a consolidator who supplies the supermarket and who supplies the customer. And to interface with supermarkets or central distribution centres, CDCs, requires scale and volume of production. Now, I would say that the supermarkets are moving towards local supply. They're coming under pressure to try and provide more local supply, and they have a number of programs where they are engaging with smaller producers and moving forward in that space. So it's definitely a positive, and it should be mentioned for sure. If we look at the vegetable sector, there's kind of two things I wanted to say here. One is that it's 160 growers. It's very specialised for the most part in terms of conventional production, and we would have seen that the traditional 20-acre producer growing 7 or 8 lines in the past had disappeared. But maybe now there's opportunities in the organic sector, and there's significant demands for information on scalable organic production systems at the moment, and definitely. I would see this as an opportunity within the veg sector. I just want to point out that our Teagasc website, so if you Google Teagasc Horticulture, and we're the first stop in terms of the search engine, and you'll find a lot of detail around vegetable production and all the other sectors there. And I would urge you to, work your way through some of that maybe before contacting one of our 5 advisors in the sectors. Okay, soft fruit. 45 million market for strawberry. Again, this is a good news story. The market is growing annually by 6% on average, which on a compound growth basis, it's a very important sector. And it's a very exciting sector in terms of opportunities. So it's not just a case of existing growers expanding, there are definitely opportunities for new entrants, particularly in certain parts of the country. Protected production under glass and polythene is the way it's gone over the last 10 years. So now we have soft fruit production over a much longer extended season. So the shoulders of the season have extended. Blueberry, I mentioned, it's 65 retail value, 65 million. It grows, production in the UK and Wales. There's no reason why we can't have some more production here with well-selected sites and the right know-how and knowledge, and some of the automation that has been developed in Holland regarding automating picking and harvesting and so on. So look, I just want to point at this stage to a series of fact sheets which we've developed over the last year. Fresh blueberry production is one that you can dig out there from the website. Cut flower production, again, flowers from the farm. This is another area where we have massive imports, cut flowers here up to 50 million euro. The euro market is 14 billion. There's a dominance of the retailers in the sector, but we have identified potential market in Teagasc for peonies, sunflowers, hardy foliage and berries, ornamental brassica, solidago, bulb crops and more. And we have a number of fact sheets, and I just wanted to move to that. Actually, I decided to put this in as well. This is about to go to print under the Horticulture Connected magazine. I think it's going to print today. So Andy Welton, our cut foliage and cut flower and our veg advisor, has written an article about sunflowers and attractive product proposition. So look that one up if you want to find some information. That's hot off the press. But look, in terms of ornamental brassica, which is cabbage to you and me, you can see here where we grew it in Clontarf College as a test site, and then it's used there on the left-hand picture. You can see it in a bouquet. So again, it's pretty amazing where you can be innovative in terms of this whole area. So again, we have an ornamental brassica production fact sheet which can be downloaded from the website. The opportunity in terms of cut foliage, the cut foliage sector, it's the greenery used as a filler in flower bouquets and arrangements. Laurel, pittosporum, eucalyptus. There's at the moment we have a small but developing industry here in Ireland. It's the foliage that provides fill and uniformity to bouquets. We do have an ideal climate around the southern and southeast coast, and it is being market led. So we have companies who have market access in Europe and further afield. So it is one that is ripe for development. It was established in the late 90s. We have about 25 growers producing 12 million stems per year at a value of 6.2 million. It's all export predominantly. And we have, our involvement is obviously on the technical service contracts with growers and the contact and direct contact with Forest Produce Limited, who are one of the main marketing companies involved. We have a test site at Clontarf College. Okay, again, I'm just pointing there to the outdoor cut foliage fact sheet. So a lot more information there. Apples, I mentioned. It's a very important sector in my view and deserving of attention. We have 10 million farm gate value at the moment. There's about 50 commercial growers. We have obviously culinary apple production, cider apple production, dessert apple production. The real headroom is in dessert apple production, where we have a lot of potential market to garner. We'll have to look at the apple opportunity. in detail. So if you're looking at this, you have to know what market you're going into, what you're going to plan. You'll have to do a direct cost and returns exercise using those varieties. Marketing Irish apples is not simple. You need to attain a very high quality to compete with imports. So there's a lot of questions that need answering before you would do any planting, I would suggest. Again, there's an apple commercial apple production fact sheet available. There's also, just at this point, and I've been just gone over time, but I just want to keep going here, production of nursery stock and ornamental plants. This fact sheet's here. It's one I would like to spend more time on. Fresh strawberry production is just part of the series. And I just, as a close, I wanted to try and draw your attention to our website, which has a lot of detail under each of the headings. A lot of materials available, and specifically there's a staff contact page as well, where you'll find one of the 5 individuals, whether it be nursery stock, Donald Flanagan, Andy Welton, Amy Keogh, Donald Gernan, Owen Sweetman. So, you know, they're all there, their contact details are there, and if you have detailed questions regarding those sectors, or myself indeed, please feel free to contact us. The other thing I'd say is a lot of people are afraid or fear, you know, there's an awful lot to know here, and how do I develop my knowledge in this whole area? And I would say we have 2 horticultural colleges, Kildorton Agricultural College and Horticultural College in Kilkenny, the College of Amenity Horticulture and Botanic Gardens. And, you know, even if you're in a scenario where a level 5, which is a 1-year, or a level 6, 2-year advanced certificate, you know, you can attain those and you can study and you can develop the skills required to try and understand how you can move forward in this business. But I would say, from a commercial setting, or for people who are already involved, a lot of the modules within these courses are offered as part-time component awards. So in theory, you can access this and build up the credits required for a level 5 or a level 6 on a part-time basis. So it's really useful. And now with the year that has gone, where a lot of teaching went online, I suspect there's a blended approach as well in terms of the theory. So the part-time component award structure covers theory and practical skills. And I would suspect that there's quite a bit of that will be delivered online in the future, but that remains to be seen. If you're interested, you could contact the colleges directly for more detail about those particular part-time courses. So look, that's our website, as I said, teagasc.ie/horticulture. Thank you very much. Over to you, Barry.
Thanks very much for that, Dermot. Great presentation. Covered a lot in that short space of time, and it's such a broad area as well. It's very, very difficult to cover it in such a short space of time. But look, we'll take questions. Lots of questions coming in for you, Dermot, as well, in relation to this. And if any of you have questions, you can just put the questions there at the bottom of your screen too. We'll put them directly to Dermot here as well. I'm just amazed though that it's 7,500 jobs in the sector. It's worth 477 million in terms of farm gate. It's just 1% of the land area of Ireland, which is fascinating. So as you mentioned, it's very, very intensive. So there's great opportunity there as well, Dermot, in some of the sectors that you mentioned, like apples, onions. Why are we not engaging more in this area? Is there a particular reason that we're not increasing, getting a bigger share of that 135 billion of apples that are, being imported, of the 80% of onions that are being imported? Is there a reason why do we need a horticultural revolution in this country?
Yeah, I would say that look, it's about market access. So in general terms, when you speak about agriculture, you know, there's a lot of commodity. You can look up what the commodity prices are, and you could decide that you want to supply your milk or cattle into a particular mart or into a dairy co-op or whatever it is. You have multiple different avenues. When it comes to the horticultural sector, you need to have skill developed and a network of contacts developed to get market access. So that's the major issue, but it's still not unsurpassable. If you develop knowledge and you're innovative in terms of how you produce a product, and you have a professional approach to production, you can develop a decent business in this space. So I think the supermarkets, yes, you know, there's a lot of control in terms of the supermarkets, and they obviously retail a lot of the product here. So, you know, the opportunities are increasing to try and engage directly with those supermarkets, but you do need to have a level of scale. So I think the future would probably hold the opportunity for producer organizations or conglomerate approaches to a market whether it be 5 or 10 small organic producers coming together to have some sort of grouping in terms of both conglomerate buying power in terms of input cost, but also in terms of marketing. So that's a whole area that probably needs to be looked at in terms of market access, the route to market.
And are there any examples of that in Ireland at the moment, of that cooperative type structure, or maybe producer groups? Because it seems logical way of, I suppose, getting a bigger corner of the market.
Yeah, there's an international the producer organisation scheme it runs across Europe, and it's a system where growers can come together. We have 4 producer organisations in commercial horticulture in Ireland. 2 of them are in the mushroom sector, and 1 is in vegetables and the other is in salad crops. So look, we have some markets, but they're producer organisations. You need a minimum of 5 growers to come together. There are certain rules around a collective, the turnover that's required to qualify and so on. And you develop, you can develop and get funding for marketing efforts in terms of developing a market and so on. So yes, and you can also get access to on-farm investments through the scheme, and this is European money. So yes, it's something that has potential. But you do need to have individuals who have a degree of scale before they come together. And sometimes as well, it works better if we have non-competing producers, who are kind of, working, who can more easily perhaps work together.
And Dermot, we're not going to grow exotic crops like bananas or avocados in this country, but Ireland's well suited to orchards and vegetable production, just as you mentioned there a while ago. And those kind of enterprises are going to bring valuable diversity and valuable farm income streams as well. What's needed to jumpstart this worthy goal of going down this route of more vegetables, more orchards in Ireland?
Well, I suppose it's where you place the emphasis. So there's probably an importance around elucidating the opportunity or packaging the proposition. So you need to have a lot of data. You need to have a lot of information around how to develop what the latest varieties are, reflective mulches, all the new systems of production, labour use efficiency. There's a lot of harvesting equipment in development in North America which needs to be brought in. Compared to 30 or even 20 or even 10 years ago, there's been huge advances in terms of varieties available for certain climates and with a certain taste profile. So what we're doing at the moment with Borbia is we have an apple development group, and we're looking at starting with Borbia, obviously starting with the market piece, and they're assessing the market and trying to work back from that. So if you look specifically at the apple sector, where you have a large offering of branded apples coming into the sector, with very high quality, it has to be said, Irish apples have their place there, and Irish apples have potential to take a foothold in a part of that market, similar to say in Scandinavian markets, where most Scandinavian countries would be 30% self-sufficient in apples, for example, and we're only 5%. So,
and Dermot, you've travelled to a lot of countries and you're involved in European projects as well. And are there any good European initiatives by other governments that you've seen that has led to this development of why Scandinavia is up to 30% in those areas? Is there any good examples that you'd say we should be looking at to support structures?
Well, yeah, I think I suppose it's about the agricultural knowledge and innovation system. It's about diversifying that as well. So you're here talking about the options program, and you're talking about diversifying the farm portfolio. I suppose my view would be that you have to diversify the ACIS, the agricultural knowledge and innovation system, as well. So what we have in terms of an ACIS is integrated in terms of knowledge, advisory, research, and so on. But is it diversified enough in terms of the ag portfolio? That's where emphasis perhaps would need to change. So, if you want to develop a sector, you need to know a lot. You need to unravel what the barriers are to development of a sector, and that requires investment and resources. Yeah.
And what parts of those ACIS are going to be important? So the ACIS is the Agricultural Knowledge Innovation System. So is it advisory, or is it other speciality areas of the ACIS that you think are important to hone in on?
Well, I think it's research as well as advisory. So it's the specialist KT advice comes after the research. So there's a lot of information, we can procure a lot of information from abroad, but it's not good enough just to take it and roll it out. You obviously have to trial it and trial varieties in certain contexts. So if you're developing a particular sector, you need an Irish context to what the learnings are abroad and what the latest thinking is abroad. So whether it be certain intensities of production in terms of planting regimes and so on. So it's a very important effort.
Dermot, loads of questions coming in for you here. Does the commercial horticultural grant cover setup costs, for example, to plant blueberry bushes? Can the cost of bushes be counted as a cost, or is it only on capital and processing equipment?
No, it was a precedent a few years ago, so yes, it can be covered. All of the inputs required can be covered for
including the bushes as well.
Yes, so it's the same with an orchard. If you're planting an orchard or if you're planting cut foliage, you get cover for the plant material.
Okay, and you can also get a grant towards the capital cost of the processing equipment?
Yeah, so you can get, I'm not going to go through every detail of the scheme. There are terms and conditions for the scheme. You can read them on the Department of Ag website. But yes, in general, you can apply for equipment and infrastructure, including buildings and equipment, obviously, fixed and mobile, with that specific horticulture.
Yeah, a question here in relation to small scale or artisan. Are there opportunities for artisan producers in Ireland? And are those grants or schemes available for small market gardeners?
Yes, the commercial horticulture grant scheme from the department is available to access the scheme. You have to be investing more than 10,000, except with the exception of beekeepers who need to be investing 2,000. So there are opportunities to access the scheme once you're investing 10,000 or more.
Okay, and beekeepers are involved in can avail of this as well?
Yes, and they do regularly, every year.
Okay, and maybe the opportunity as well. That's part of that question as well. Is there much opportunity? I know you mentioned that the opportunities of farmers grouping together in cooperative type structures. But are there opportunities as well for small scale producers with polytunnels, maybe supplying local supermarkets? That question is coming here as well.
Yeah, there are opportunities at every level of scale in terms of this business. So yes is the answer, and we have lots of examples of them all over the country, people producing for smaller markets with turnovers of 40, 50, 60,000 euro, and some of them have scaled upwards and are making quite a nice living. So look, it's been done. People are accessing markets. So it's
maybe dealing for local supermarkets. Well, Dermot, a query there is in relation to the schemes as well, that for somebody who applies for them for the very first time, do they need to show experience within the horticultural sector, or can they just come in fresh from mainstream agriculture and turn their land, or can their son or daughter, for example, take over the land and put up a polytunnel and avail of the grant, or do they need to have some course done in advance?
No, you don't need to have a course done, but you need to show competence in that's where we come in terms of understanding what's involved. And so for argument's sake, somebody coming into the sector, you mentioned a son or daughter, perhaps they have accountancy skills or marketing skills or whatever it is, and they're bringing something new to the business. It's not just horticultural skills that are required to develop a business here. So there's a range of skills that are required, and I think that would cover off a lot of people in terms of previous farming experience.
A similar type question here: if you have no background in agriculture but have acquired land, circa 20 acres, is it worth looking into these areas, or is it foolish?
Well, it's not foolish. I would say look into the area, but like the fact is that there are so many options here in terms of geeing up your information sources. You can start to attend part-time education and figure out what modules you want to cover. You can very quickly refine the area that you're interested in and try and pick out those modules in terms of component awards, like I mentioned in the last slide, and get some information on it. And you shouldn't be moving ahead without trying to address the knowledge deficit that you would have coming from outside the sector.
Yeah, and a lot of questions here in relation to your presentation, Dermot. It will be available on teagasc.ie/farm business options. So you mentioned a lot of courses that are available in Kildalton and at the Botanics as well. So those courses, people can look them up afterwards as well, and you can see this presentation online afterwards also.
Absolutely.
Any comments on the lack of supports and funding around organic production relative to traditional conventional sectors, beef and dairy?
Well, look, my comment would be that look, we have 5 advisors. We operate across conventional. So we say in the vegetable sector, we work directly. We have 1 advisor in vegetables in Ireland, and we work directly with our clients in the conventional, the larger growers. We don't have a lot of leeway in terms of dealing with organics. So we
I presume an organic grower is just as entitled to the capital grants that's available in the horticultural grant scheme as a conventional farmer.
Oh, absolutely, and there's also an organic scheme as well. But there's freedom to apply to the commercial hort grant scheme. It opens every year in October.
Enjoying the webinar, very informative. A question: can you see any future in growing hazelnuts, chestnuts, etc.? Is there a market there for it? And more importantly, what are the pros and cons for going down this route? Jane?
Again, I'd say, Barry, that's a rabbit hole. Personally, I don't know. I've looked at cob nuts in the past, and I've had questions in this area in the past, but it's definitely not something that I would be able to answer now. I do think, from what I remember, I do think that there were questions. I think it was difficult to see a return. I think if you have to capital front load an investment and wait 4, 5, 6, or even longer years for a commercial return in terms of a yield, a commercial yield, and so on, that could be particularly challenging in a sector. So I think that can be a very significant headwind from a investment perspective. To just forget about what crop you're talking about and look at it on paper. But look, I'd be happy to try and drill out an answer with that individual if they want to contact me directly, and we can see.
Okay. And is there anyone doing that, Dermot, in Ireland at the moment, growing hazelnut?
There are some growers. They're not necessarily on our radar, and they're not clients of ours, so to speak, but we have had questions, I know, in the past from a few individuals. So I think it is happening, but not necessarily at scale.
Dermot, what's your opinion? Another question: what's your opinion on pesticide-free hydroponic leafy green Brassica herb production? Is it a viable option in Ireland to replace imports?
Yes. I suppose, there's kind of 2 schools of thought on this. There's obviously glasshouse production. You saw a slide there where I referenced glasshouse production, modern glasshouse production of leafy greens and so on. And then you have what's pretty getting a lot of media attention at the moment, which is vertical growing systems. So the shelf system, vertical growing, stacking production, and using LED lights in closed, dark environment, say in a warehouse scenario and so on. Personally speaking, I think both have their place. I think glasshouse production of leafy greens, the idea that they have advanced that sector to the point where they have eliminated a lot of the labour required to harvest the crop, or at least those systems are available commercially. Whether from an investment perspective they're doable is a different scenario. It depends on your market and your product mix, but they are available at least. So glasshouse production of those crops, to my mind, are still a little bit ahead of vertical growing. Vertical growing systems are still iterating, or there's different versions of them, and they are developing, and definitely there's a future for them. But I think it's a case of maybe the second mouse gets the cheese. Like, at what point do you invest if they're changing and becoming more efficient? Should you wait and see, or should you move with it and so on? So it's quite an expensive investment as well. So look, but I still think it's a great initiative.
Okay. A question here about Silvopasture for apple production. I know that's an area close to your heart, is apple production. You've worked as an advisor in that area for many years. How much attention is being given to alternative and regenerative ways of doing things in mainstream agriculture? So I think we actually discussed this last week with Silvopasture in wetlands in organic farms. And I suppose, how would they fit in drying up maybe wetlands? Would there be any apple tree varieties that could be done as maybe agroforestry or Silvopasture?
Not really. I would say from the point of view of site selection. So site selection and soil is obviously very, very important. So if you're planting a commercial orchard, you're going to the best ground you can find. Apple trees don't like wet feet, they like a nice free draining soil. So I would say no on that basis.
Okay, well, maybe what about the better soils? Would it make sense as maybe like agroforestry in pastures?
Yeah, I think when you come down to producing, it depends on your market. If you're producing maybe a processing apple of some sort, perhaps there's an opportunity where you're mechanically harvesting shaking trees and both delivering them to a processing facility. But when it comes to producing fresh, ready-to-eat Irish apples, with all this food safety issues concerning production and so on, and no, it's not something you would mix. You're growing apples, and you have a very tight regime in terms of production efficiency and so on. It's not something you would do. It would be a much more extensive system. And at the moment, to make money in apples, you have to be pretty intensive.
Okay, thanks, Dermot. If you were a young person and were in the process of setting up a business in the sector, who would you go to for further advice and questions? We'll do this to you.
Yeah, look, we have a website there, and there's a lot of information in there if you drill it through. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in having even read some of the information that's there and some of the fact sheets. As I say, we're all available. That's our job.
Okay, and I'd also add to that as well that there's a lot of courses being run across the country in the educational training boards, the ETBs, and Start Your Own Business, as well as the local enterprise offices. So it is well worthwhile looking at the websites for the ETB or the LEO in your local area, and maybe looking at a Start Your Own Business course, because essentially you are going down a business route here. You're starting from scratch, maybe in some cases. You're looking at areas like taxation. You're looking at areas of employment, labor laws, all of that. So it will be important that you get one of those courses under your belt to before starting. Are there grants for flower farming? Another question here, Dermot.
Yeah, well, again, it's a horticultural sector. So yes, the horticultural grant scheme is available. It depends on what you want to do. So if there's infrastructure required, for sure. But it would be you have to develop a specific business plan for what you're proposing and apply through the scheme, and the advisor will tell you what's in and what's out. But flower production.
Irish people seem to like the very personal nature of flowers. Really, are there opportunities here for artisan florists in Ireland?
Yeah, I think that there's opportunities there for sure. If you look at the UK, there's about 600, a grouping of about 600 farm flower producers together, and there's probably no reason why we couldn't have similar here, particularly when you think about the opportunity. So if you talk to Andy Welton there, you'll see he's mentioning things like peonies, and he's mentioning sunflowers. Now we have done work which shows that you could argue that there are niche markets in the context of the size of the wider European market, but for flowers that don't necessarily travel well, we probably have potential to grow more of those, But again, you need to have information. So you can't just, there's questions being asked here, but, like there's so many rabbit holes which we can go down. You would need to do a bit of due diligence around the market size, do some market research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd imagine for artisan flowers that opportunity would exist, and that there's existing machinery on site, maybe tractors on site, maybe to move compost. So it could complement maybe an existing business on the farm. Yeah. Another question that's come in here, Dermot. What are the opportunities for cut flowers in Ireland? I'm particularly interested in narcissi, ranunculi, tulips, roses, archaea cosmos, and chrysanthemums. Yeah,
look, I'm going to refer that one. I'm not going to even go there, Barry, because it's just too specific, and I can't retain the knowledge. But I know there are opportunities in the sector. As I said, there's 50 million euros of imports a year, and there's a high end to that particular sector in terms of market, and it's definitely one you could point to. So I would suggest they talk with Andy.
Okay. Yeah, that speciality is there in house. Another one has come in a similar area. Are there any young up and coming florists in Ireland that now really want Irish flowers?
Yeah, again, it's a sector. I'm not as plugged into that sector in terms of the trends and so on. I know it is a sector that maybe is there's definitely an increase in demand for quality Irish. I'm hearing this all right, so I don't think why it'd be different to any other sector. But I definitely again would put that question to Andy, who's plugged into the kind of international trends that are happening here.
Yeah, it mightn't be your area, this particular question, but yeah. Are there any opportunities for developing new crop varieties?
Well, new crop varieties in terms of what, vegetables or fruit?
I presume we were talking here about fruit, and maybe with varying climates as well. But the question is just about new crop varieties. Maybe we're related to climate change and maybe new technologies that's available in Ireland. Maybe that we could introduce new crops.
Yeah, look, new crops, I would say new varieties, because if you have climate change, it does create again the capacity to maybe try out things that we didn't do in the past. So if you had a view of commercial horticulture in a particular line from 20 years ago, I would suggest that people refine that view now based on the amount of breeding that has been done and the varieties that are available for selection and so on. So, like for example, in the blueberry sector, there are varieties now which will obviously extend the season as well. So the season used to be 6 weeks, and now it can be 8, 10, 12 weeks with some protection and so on. So there are opportunities. If you look at the strawberry sector, it was in the field 20 years ago, and now it's all under protection. And you can get Irish strawberries using various different varieties or a program of varieties, which is effectively technology adopting varieties. And it runs from February to December. So you can get, okay, they're using heat at the end of the season in the glasshouse scenario to bookend the season. But now you can get Irish strawberries for 10, 11 months of the year.
Another question, does the horticultural grant cover producing, for example, apples with the silvopasture approach?
Well, the grant would cover the investment. So if you're making a particular investment, but there would be an adjudication on how, what the business approach is in terms of, is it adding cost or is it taking it away? So it will be evaluated as a business plan. And that's, so technically speaking, yes, but, what elements of the plan would warrant grant investment would be a decision of the Department of Ag.
Lots of comments coming in here, Dermot, as well. It's on the similar vein, but essentially similar to this. It is environmentally unfriendly. Is it to import flowers and fruit from places such as Kenya, Ethiopia, Ecuador, or Colombia? We need to focus on homegrown and shorter supply chains. I think you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I would. It's that's more of a statement than a question, but I agree. I think it's a fair point that obviously, I suppose COVID as well kind of indicated over the last year, that supply chains are not necessarily linear, that they're highly complex. And when one element of the supply chain is disrupted, you can have a kind of a ripple effect. So I think simplifying supply chains is maybe a lesson from the pandemic.
Yeah, Dermot, most sectors have become very digitalized in the last number of years, and you referred to it there in your talk there as well. Can you describe maybe to us the level of automation that has been introduced to the horticultural sector maybe in the last 20 years or so?
Well, look, in general, in terms of automation, you kind of have to look at the most advanced sectors. So if you look at the mushroom sector or the glasshouse sector, in the mushroom sector, you'll see that all the filling and emptying, the operational side of the business is there's machinery deployed and automation deployed in terms of filling, ruffling, casing, and so on. Now the real effort is behind robotic harvesting, and it's a project that we've actually started in January this year, a soft drip project in Teagasc Ashtown with some international partners, where we're looking at the end effector system at the end of a robot arm to pick mushrooms, and it's a Horizon 2020 project based on obviously engineering and trialing the system in a real world scenario. So we're involved in that project, and I know the industry internationally are involved in terms of technology adoption in that sector to mitigate some of the issues around input cost. And so that's for sure one area. If you look at the glasshouse sector again, you see, the new standard of glasshouse production is a very, very high standard in terms of technology adoption. You would see, say, for example, the tomato growers in Ireland are using CO2 enriched environments. They're under modern glass production. They're increasing yield by 30%. They've increased yield over 20 years by maybe 60-70% per meter squared in glasshouse scenarios. So they've advanced non-stop, I would say.
I was reading recently about ag robots that have been introduced with vision sensors there as well that can judge the colour and the shape of the strawberries. So lots of new technologies there that'll be coming to the fore in the future. Dermot, another question, what are the climate change challenges and its associated threats of new pests and diseases, as well as the pressures on land use, etc., on the horticultural sector?
Yeah, look, there's always an issue with, if you're trying to produce in a monoculture scenario, you're obviously trying to mitigate the risk of pest and disease infiltration. And yes, it is a challenge, particularly if you have less and less armory in terms of available solutions.
Yeah.
I would say though that taking production under protection into glasshouse and polytunnel scenarios has been very positive for the sector, because it gives you the opportunity to narrow the two white lines within which you operate. So if you're in a field scenario where you're trying to control all sorts of things, and you take yourself into a controlled environment scenario where you can manipulate the climate and you can actually reduce the stress on the crop, you can eliminate the disease pressure to a large degree. You can deploy biological control. At the moment, we have a lot of products being developed which are biological in nature, whether it be predatory pests, of natural predators of pests in production, and they work really well under protection where you have a closed environment. So you have the opportunity to kind of reduce crop protection product use, increase biological control, and you have the opportunity to, obviously improve yield and kind of narrow the risk. So like everything is an investment, and if you can reduce the risk element of that investment, you can obviously make big inroads.
Yeah, as you mentioned, future pesticide availability, that cocktail of chemistry is getting smaller and smaller all the time.
Yeah.
Another question, Dermot, here: are fruit and vegetable growers eligible for basic payment scheme payments?
Some are. That's down to the individual farm, so, and how it's parcelled and so on. So I'll that's an individual. It's not a general answer I can give to that question.
Okay. Another question: there seems to be continuous price wars, and very often horticultural produce are placed on the market as loss leaders. Retailers are continuously involved in price wars, and they have very little interest in the true horticultural business costs. This is, I suppose, maybe a comment. Would you agree with that? And you did mention that in your presentation as well about the price wars that are there.
Yeah, look, like supermarkets, if they're interested in market share, I assume they're business people and they're running a business. And what was the rest of the comment? Was it about below cost selling or discounting? And
yeah,
was it?
Yeah, retailers are continuously involved in price wars, and that they're being sold as loss. Horticultural produce is very often being placed in the market as a loss leader.
Yeah, look, there's instances of that, I'm sure, where below cost selling have been recorded and they've been kind of in the media and so on over time. I agree.
Yeah,
it does happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it's more a comment than anything else, Dermot. Look, and we are running out of time. A lot of questions here about the whole area of labour and labour bills. What percentage of turnover would labour bills be, and how difficult is it nowadays getting pickers and people to, and especially with the impact of national minimum wage?
Yeah, I would say that labour is a key challenge in the sector for sure, particularly obviously in a scenario where the movement of workers from other jurisdictions is impinged as well. So yes, labour is a requirement, and there is a lot of efforts going on at the moment to try and mitigate that, whether it be through technology adoption and so on, and developing new production systems which increase labour use efficiency. So some sectors are more reliant on labour than others, but I would say that the professional horticultural sector and the minimum wages as mentioned there, I think there's a lot of advances made in the last 10 years, and I think there are a lot of opportunities as well for people and individuals and students from abroad and so on. There's a lot of different avenues being explored to solve that particular problem, and a seasonal worker scheme to boot. So there's a lot of kind of structured responses to that issue in development, I would say.
Dermot, just a question there myself. Like you mentioned, the 477 million farm gate value of the horticulture.
Yeah.
What percentage of that would be of that turnover would be labour bills? Would it be 50% of it?
It depends on the sector. So if you're talking about some of the more intensive, you're talking about the input cost. 40% of your input costs will be labour.
Okay.
Maybe 50% in certain lines, and then there's quite a few that are around 20, 25, 30% of your input costs is labour. Yeah.
Yeah. And final question here, Dermot: is there an obvious knowledge gap for the majority of farmers? Do we need regional introductory courses to explore appropriate local solutions?
Yeah, I think there's a knowledge deficit for sure. I think there's a general lack of understanding about the sector out there, if you don't mind me saying so. And, there's an opportunity perhaps to dig a little bit deeper. But I think individuals have to try and figure out what do they have. So sometimes people come to this equation with the idea that they have a bank of land. And sometimes I kind of end up saying to people that maybe the land availability is only one element. You do need to consider what other things you were bringing to the table in terms of maybe the potential to access a market or develop a market and to understand a market. And I think that's probably key here. The other is your capacity to obviously invest and make some investments. Whether, you may be deciding to get in at a very small scale, that's fine and that's much more doable. But you may be, looking to make a decent investment. And I think you do need to consider your knowledge deficit here as well and try and figure out how you get the skills and the information required to make sound investment decisions.
Dermot, that's been fantastic and very informative there today. Thanks very much for your time. And lots of questions coming about your contact details. You'll probably be inundated with questions maybe after this, but I know your presentation, at the end of your presentation, I think you have your contact details on that. Is there, if anybody wants to contact the horticulture unit in general, what's the best email?
Well, I've just highlighted it there on the last slide. So I've given you the Teagasc Horticulture, and you'll see the breakdown of all the different sectors, including a staff contact page. I'm top of that list, and my mobile number is even on the website. So just Google my name and you'll find me, yeah?
All right, that's great. Dermot Callaghan, Head of Horticulture in Teagasc, thank you very much for joining us. And folks, thank you for joining us here today as well. It's good, great to get the questions coming in as they are every week. Next week, I'll be talking to my colleague Gordon Peppard about the whole area of collaborative farming and the opportunities there for collaboration with other farmers. So from me, Barry Caslin, thank you very much for watching, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.